Our next speaker, Rich Hoyer, is the perfect choice to tell us about another level of interactions between plants and other species. In this case, he's going to talk about plants and birds. As most of you know, Arizona is a hotspot not only for native plant diversity, but also for bird diversity. And so it's a very reasonable wedding between the two to generate lots of interesting stories. Rich has been an avid naturalist since he was a teen, and he doesn't just focus on birds, but he was interested in plants, butterflies, birds, and all kinds of other things. He earned a dual degree in zoology and German from Oregon State University, and then he migrated to southern Arizona, where he started learning a whole new flora. He got involved with bird surveys with the Forest Service, and then he moved over to become a professional bird guide, and today he's a professional bird guide with the Wings Birding Tours. Even though he leads trips all over the world, he came back to Tucson for many years as his home base. And so he's a good person to talk to us about Arizona birds and their plants.
Thanks, Lynn. So a bit more background about how I got interested in plants and birds started basically with this job with the Forest Service when I moved to southeastern Arizona. Before then, for at least 10 years, I was birding and botanizing side by side, but separately. I didn't quite connect the two. I didn't know how I didn't even understand that birds and plants actually were interacting in any way. But during this Forest Service study in southeastern Arizona, it was specifically on neotropical migrants in the Sky Islands. Fantastic, so lucky to get that job. We had these transects, these straight line transects through these amazing forests, and we had to stop every 300 meters and count the birds. And the birds were different at every point, and I began to sort of make a game out of it. What could I see at the next stop? The habitat looked different, and the birds were different, and I started to see patterns emerge. So that was one way I started getting interested in birds and plants and what they were doing. Then I also began reading more of the primary literature on bird biogeography, and most notably Russ Greenberg's amazing experiments that he did with birds and how they choose their habitats. He actually reared warblers from the egg in laboratory and did experiments to figure out what they were doing. So what turns out to be a lot of the case is that birds are using psychology. There's a psychology involved in how birds choose their habitat. If you are a human looking at this amazing scenery in southern Arizona, or even an insect, that talk from Jillian was just amazing. I learned so much. You're looking at the species of plants. You're noticing the saguaros and the ocotillo and the foothill palo verde on the slope, all the different cactuses and brittle bush, and there's definitely some acacia in there somewhere. That's not what a bird is looking at first glance. Imagine you're a bird migrating, you need a stopover, or you're away to make a home territory for the breeding season, or you're looking for a place to spend the winter. Or if you're not a migratory bird, you're a juvenile bird setting out to form your own territory. You're using psychology to find a place that looks comfortable. You're looking at the shape of the habitat, as it turns out, for almost all birds. So that habitat looks very different from this habitat, even though a lot of the plants are the same, especially this ocotillo. But birds are looking at more like the distance of the plants to each other, the shapes of the plants, the slope. How is the ground cover? Is it full of grass? Is it gravelly? Is it rocky? Is there a diversity of shrubs? What's the spacing between the shrubs? Or are there trees? Is there a variety of trees? And trees depending on the species, give a different shape to the habitat. For example, these pine trees look different than a habitat that has, say, some deciduous trees. It gives it the whole plant habitat a different shape. Of course, there's also edge. There are birds you might find in this particular situation that need this sort of edge of pine forest and the meadow. There might be birds that will be found in wide open meadows with no pine trees, and birds found only in deep forest of the pines, but some need this edge. This is also a perfectly good habitat for a lot of birds. Once a bird has found the habitat where it feels comfortable, it actually needs more things. It needs food. It needs water. It needs a place to nest. It needs stuff to make its nest out of. It needs places to hide from predators. Um, there's a lot of insects in this particular habitat. I think this is the Sonoyta grasslands. Yeah, this is the spot where they have reintroduced black-tailed prairie dogs. Cassin sparrow is a very common bird here. It feels perfectly at home in this wide open space. And they eat lots of insects during the monsoon. Insects that a red-faced warbler would also perfectly be capable of eating. But there's no way a red-faced warbler would ever land here. It would find plenty of food if it knew how, and if it felt comfortable in here. But a red-faced warbler here would feel like a sitting duck to a kestrel flying over. This, on the other hand, has plenty of insect food for a breeding cassin sparrow, but a cassin sparrow wouldn't know what to do in all this forest. It would feel completely closed in. Its psychology will not let it live here. So, having said that, birds have interesting relationships with specific plants, whether they know it or not. They just happen to find them accidentally, actually. So, if you are living in southern Arizona or anywhere in Arizona, most people live in the lowlands. I lived in Tucson for 25 years. If you have a space where you might want to plant some plants to make it a more habitable place for birds, it's kind of difficult to create that shape, but you can plant some plants, and I have some recommendations to make your habitat friendly. No, I don't recommend necessarily putting a trash can and a grill out for attracting these black-crowned night herons. No, I have better ideas. Better idea is just to plant your backyard full of natives, any kind of natives. As you learn from Jillian, there's these incredible relationships between insects and plants, and where there's insects, there will be birds. Birds will find food. Who knows if any bird would recognize this particular plant, has ever identified a Mojave Desert star. Who knows if there's a specific relationship that a bird might have with this plant. But this plant most certainly has some insect relationships, and birds will eat those insects. This is one of my favorite families, by the way. No, it is my favorite family. This is in the composite family, or Asteraceae, because they have such interesting structure plants. And you'll see one of my favorite at the end. Or this red fuzz saxifrage. This one is, the previous plant, by the way, was in the Waterman Mountains, northwest of Tucson. And this one is in the mountains just north of Tucson, the Catalina Mountains. So if you have some naturally rocky, gravelly soil in your backyard, maybe this will be a perfectly good plant to plant. Just stuff your backyard full of natives. But the best plants are those that offer really specifically food and shelter and or a place to nest, or multiple things to attract birds. And unfortunately, the best plants are big plants. And so save some space in your room, and if you want to, in your yard, and if you want to start from seed, plan ahead. These take a long time to acquire a stage where they're useful to birds. Or if you have a lot of money, you can buy a big one already. I think everybody probably knows the relationships that saguaro has with birds. Gilded flicker makes its nest in saguaros. Further south in Sonora and Baja, they use other species of giant cactus, but they build their nest into the plant, which forms a wonderful cavity used by lots of other wildlife afterwards. The Gila woodpecker will also use saguaro. And these are this is a very common bird in Tucson because they all build their nests in all sorts of places. The Gila woodpecker the gilded flicker is actually quite local in just the Sonoran saguaro forests in southern Arizona. But once they've built their nest, then a whole host of other wildlife will use this amazing cavity. Brown-crested flycatcher loves old woodpecker nests and saguaro. It's a very noisy, conspicuous bird in southern Arizona deserts. And the elf owl, one of my favorites. One other thing I love about this photo that you almost never notice in wildlife is that little black tip to the eyebrows. Elf owls will nest in cavities of almost any woodpecker, anything down to a ladderback woodpecker's hole, and they'll build their nest in anywhere, in any kind of habitat. It doesn't have to be saguaro forest, as long as it's warm enough at night for arthropods to be crawling around. They like all sorts of spiders, centipedes, sun scorpions, moths, beetles, and even occasionally a snake or a gecko. I have a hunch that this bird would be a very common breeding bird all throughout Tucson if there were nest boxes in everyone's backyard, maintained to keep the house sparrows out. But saguaros are really good wildlife attractant plants because they also offer fruit. And in fact, you learned from one of the previous talks, the flowers, with a bird that is most attracted to the fruits are flocks and flocks of white-winged doves you can see flying over Tucson when the saguaros are in bloom and when they're in fruit. And as soon as the fruit's done, these birds pretty much leave. Who knows where they go. House finches and orioles and all sorts of other birds feast on the fruits of saguaro. The other plant, well, as long as I'm on cactus, you might as well make room for a chain fruit cholla. This is the one known as jumping cholla. Of course, they don't jump. You learned from Philip yesterday how they actually work, how they spread. They don't provide seed, but these provide the absolute perfect cover for curve-billed thrashers. Without cholla, you will not have any curve-billed thrashers. Everything about the habitat might be perfect for them. There might be plenty of food. They might feel comfortable there, but they won't have a place to nest unless you have a cholla in your backyard. This is in my backyard in Tucson. They chose several different chollas over the years, and it only takes about 4 or 5 years for a cholla to be big enough to be home to a curve-billed thrasher. And habitat that looks exactly the same without the cholla around Tucson and southern Arizona, you'll find the very closely related Bendire's thrasher instead. Cactus wrens are in decline in most of southern Arizona, especially in urban areas like Tucson and Phoenix. And I suspect this is because of infill, where there used to be lots of empty lots filled with cholla. Cactus wrens had places to nest, and now they don't have as many places. They build their stick nests in other plants as well, but chollas are their favorite. Make some more room for netleaf hackberry. If I had a really big backyard, I would put a dozen netleaf hackberries in my backyard. These short, squiggly, stiff branches are perfect cover. Anything can hide in there from a predator. Not even a sharp-shinned hawk can get through there. And in the summertime, the leaves are host to all kinds of interesting insects that birds will feed on. But the best of all are these fruits that they have all winter long. And even you can eat the fruits. They're not super juicy. Don't pop into your mouth and eat them. The outer hull is something like a popcorn hull. If you roll it around in your fingers, it kind of cracks off. And inside the hull is mostly a very hard woody seed that'll break your teeth if you bite into it. But there's a thin coating on the outside. If you just mull it around between your molars and chew that coating off, it's super sweet, super flavorful, and tastes a bit to me like pumpkin pie. I have seen more species of birds feeding on these fruits in winter than any other plant in Arizona. Just a few of them: northern cardinal, its close relative, the pyrrholoxia, often called the desert cardinal. Crystal thrasher, which like the curve-billed thrasher feeds mostly on arthropods that it finds in soils digging with its bill. Well, I've seen feeding on this. If you can't really see this bird in the tree, well, that's another benefit of netleaf hackberries, that they're dense enough that a curve-billed crystal thrasher will come up into the tree. They're very secretive, and this is about the only photo I have where you can actually see what the bird looks like. Ash-throated flycatchers, we have small populations that winter in Arizona, and they subsist primarily on fruits. Further south in Mexico and in parts of the borderlands in southwestern Arizona, they'll feed on elephant tree fruits. But in southeastern Arizona, they feed on the hackberry fruits. And this very close relative and near lookalike, Nutting's flycatcher, is mostly a Mexican species. But the first full wintering bird ever found in the United States in 1997 was at Patagonia Lake State Park, and it was feeding on these netleaf hackberries all winter long. Rufous-backed robin is another Mexican rarity that shows up in Arizona in the winter. Most years there are 2 or 3 around, and almost invariably they are in a thicket of netleaf hackberries. They will also eat other berries, but that's their favorite fruit. Another plant that will take up lots of space in your yard, but I just put one of these. I don't know if you recognize this beautiful catkin. It's a very, very common plant. This is this is velvet mesquite. Velvet mesquite is something of a problematic plant. It's become more abundant in southeastern Arizona than it probably formerly was. It can be kind of weedy and take over. If there are too many of them, they'll steal water from all the other plants. They're sort of the equivalent of western juniper in the Great Basin area. So make room for at least one mesquite. These are the classic solar pump water pumps. They have a super deep taproot and they create energy from the sun through their leaves to pump that water up into the new growth, which is then fed on by all kinds of insects. And they create the flowers, amazing butterflies around the flowers, moths of all kinds, caterpillars, all kinds of hemipterans feed on the sap. There are things that feed in the twigs, tons of insect food for birds. Bell's vireo loves mesquites. Lucy's warbler, which I don't have a good picture of, they're not that much to look at anyway. They really like mesquite. They're almost 100% tied to velvet mesquite, in fact. Migrants of any kind will stop by in the Sonoran Desert where there's mesquite. Wilson's warbler is a very common migrant, and they are perfectly happy in a lush mesquite. Buick's wrens are really good at probing the crevices in the bark. That's one thing I love about the native mesquites, or the bark full of spiders and other arthropods. Ladderback woodpeckers forage on all thickness of stems, and they differ from the Gila woodpecker, which requires bigger trees. The ladderback woodpeckers will feed on even the thinnest branches of mesquite, and that's why these are found from the Mojave through the Sonoran Desert, even into the Chihuahuan Desert, where the Gila woodpecker stops right at the Chihuahuan Desert border. It's rare in most of New Mexico. And then finally on the mesquite is the mesquite mistletoe, which offers more cover. I've seen a verdin nest built right into mesquite mistletoe, but the phainopepla, a really interesting bird on its own taxonomically, it's one of 4 species of this really interesting silky flycatcher family. They feed almost exclusively on mistletoe berries, and in southern Arizona, those are the mesquite mistletoe berries. This is a plant I don't see much in urban gardens. I think it's overlooked. Maybe they're hard to grow. This is the evergreen sumac. And like these other plants, it being evergreen, short twigs, dense growth, perfect cover, great place for birds to nest. But the real attractant is also these berries, which it has in winter. And I've seen it a lot in the Atascosa Highlands. If you saw Sue Carnahan's talk, most of the places that she talked about has lots of this evergreen sumac. And where I've done the Christmas bird count down there, I always stand and watch a thicket of evergreen sumac, and invariably a hermit thrush will come out. And at least a couple of times while watching for hermit thrush at these thickets in the winter, I've caught sight of elegant trogon. Maybe if you have a bunch of hackberries and sumac in your yard, you might attract elegant trogons to winter in your yard. Who knows? And then there's a bunch of other interesting plants I would put in my yard, especially if I had a slope, a big sloping hillside that needed to be vegetated. I hear there's some people who in this conference signing up from Australia might be wondering why do I have an Australian plant here? Well, this is an amazing plant. It's found in every vegetated continent in the world and some really remote islands, such as Hawaii and the Caribbean. I've seen it in Jamaica. I've seen it in South America and Bolivia. And there are other species of Dodonea as well. But this is an interesting plant. It reaches its northernmost distribution in the desert Southwest, not too far north of Tucson, and evergreen, wonderful structure. And if you plant it alongside some of this amazing oregano, this is my favorite plant to walk by and take a little twig and rub it between my fingers and smell it. It smells like a little bit like sassafras, or the natural, cleaner, simple green. They must flavor it with or scent it with oregano. It's in the verbena family. Also, just barely entering the United States in southern Arizona is the kidney wood, which during the dry season doesn't look so impressive, but during the summer, it has this amazing inflorescences, often covered with butterflies. You can actually see a few of these, I'm not sure what they are, checker spots feeding from them. And then even more restricted basically to the area that Sue Carnahan talked about, is the Gooding's ash. They're in the Atascosa and Pajarita Mountains, and north in the Tumacacri Mountains as well. Adorable ash, little tiny leaves, not these great big crowded these velvet ashes. And then I would put in a few doll's head. Now this is by far my favorite composite, my favorite plant in my favorite family. And here I'll explain why. If you don't know why a plant is called a composite, it's because it used to be in the family Compositae, which of course is now Asteraceae. And that's because a typical composite is composed of many flowers. There's a head with at least two kinds of flowers in most, the ray flowers and the disc flowers. So it's composed of multiple flowers. Yet the doll's head, and I'll point out here, has just one, there's no ray flowers. But if you look closely at this disc flower right here, big showy ones, it has these green involucral bracts below it, or here's a better example of one right here, these green involucral bracts. That is to say that each flower here is its own head. It is no longer composed of multiple flowers, it's been decomposed to have one flower per head. But on top of that, all of these heads have been compounded at the ends of the branches. The peduncles that would support a single head have all become so short that it has evolved to look like a head of flowers when it's actually multiple heads. So I think it was my friend Brad Boyle coined the phrase, the decomposed compound composite. That is the doll's head. And it's not only a beautiful plant, it's very good for butterflies. If you were to put all these plants onto a slope like that in your backyard, if you had a slope like that, throw in a mesquite, throw in an ocotillo, a sotol, some vines. How about that Passiflora arizonica that Sue showed yesterday? You would create the perfect habitat that very closely resembles the Sonoran thorn scrub, Sinaloan thorn scrub, that almost reaches Arizona and is home to some very local birds in Arizona, such as the rufous-capped warbler, which now, as of the past 25 years, has grown to maybe 5 to 10 pairs in Arizona. One thing they need, if I go back to the other slide, you see in the lower left, is they need water. They need to have some sort of surface water. The black-capped gnatcatcher was known from 1 or 2 pairs breeding in the entire United States up until 2002, when there was a sudden incursion, presumably from Sonora directly to the south. And now there are, who knows how many pairs, 50 or 100 pairs, still very rare and always a good find, always in areas near that very complex thorn scrub habitat. And then the most iconic bird of these little pockets of thorn scrub-like habitat in southeastern Arizona barely entered the United States. It's the only breeding bird in Arizona that has never occurred in any other US state, unless they have found it in Guadalupe Canyon in New Mexico. People are looking. And if you have that habitat in your backyard, you might have this bird in your backyard. They're rapidly growing in their population. There has been pairs recently in as far north as Box Canyon and in Puerto Canyon in southern Arizona, which is very close to Tucson and Green Valley. And with that, I have these recommendations. If you do live in southern Arizona, a great place for all these native plants is Desert Survivors Nursery. And several of the speakers have mentioned SciNet Data Portal. Maybe a lot of you don't know what that is, but it's a fantastic website and a resource for lists of native plants by county with range maps of specimens, well curated. And for most current names, I always go to the Q website, plantsoftheworldonline.org. Not always updated rapidly, but inaturalist.org also follows their taxonomy for the most part, and that's where I submit all of my plant, insect, and other bug photos. Anyway, that's it. Thanks, Lynn, and thank you everybody, and Ray for organizing all this. The tech behind all this has been great. It's been really fun.
Thanks so much, Rich. That's really a great recipe you've given us for how to insert native plants into our local habitats if we have the space and if we have the energy and inclination. So that's really great. We do have a couple questions for you. And one of them sort of reflects your comment about Dodonea being in Australia as well. And it asks, will Arizona birds use non-native food sources? For instance, are Texas or California plants that don't grow in Arizona non-native plants that Arizona birds won't eat? And will Arizona birds eat seeds or flowers from Australian plants? So how broad are their dietary?
Yes, well, so there are quite a few non-native plants that offer a food source to birds. And in fact, there's oh goodness, what's this Australian plant called? Pachycarpa Is that what it's called? It looks sort of like a cottonwood tree. It
Uh,
is planted around Tucson, and it is a wonderful food source for red-naped sapsuckers, or even a occasional rare yellow-bellied sapsucker. Um, but that's the only thing they offer. And almost in every case, in fact, eucalyptus trees, the flowers are full of nectar, and hummingbirds and warblers in the winter will dip their faces into eucalyptus flowers and get the nectar. But that's pretty much the only thing they offer. They don't offer any of the insects that otherwise complete a bird's life cycle. They're very limited. So there are, yes, there are things that non-natives can offer birds, but tends to be just very shallow, one-dimensional.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Do curve-billed thrashers have a preference for one or another of the chollas? For instance, are we more likely to see nests in chain fruit as opposed to staghorn or teddy bear?
Yeah, the denser the better. So yeah, chain fruit seems to be the favorite. They'll nest also in teddy bear cholla. And the others, if it's a dense enough, it depends on how the plant grows. Every plant has an individual growth pattern, but they need a place where the nest will fit in nice and dense.
I was interested in your comments about how birds assess the habitat and the structural components of the habitat. Do you know of any experimental data on any single bird species that sort of investigates what are the parameters? Are they looking for spaces? Are they looking for size? What are the actual physical things they're keying on? Do you know?
No, nobody knows. You'd have to actually investigate each and every species separately.
Yeah.
And there are these studies that I really don't like being conducted in the Andes to try to determine why birds are at certain elevations, and they try to come up with these very grand theories. And I think that's a mistake, that birds that occur at high elevations don't occur at lower elevations because of some grand theory. I think every bird has its own reasons. The best experimental data that I know of is when I mentioned from Russ Greenberg, and they found that in the winter range, hooded warblers, males and females, are in different habitats. That was really interesting. Males are in older forest and females are often in younger, scrubbier forest. But what is it about that? Well, I thought this was brilliant. First of all, he looked at the different habitats and created an index of verticality. They took photos of the habitats where they saw males in all directions. And on the photos, they drew lines on the major stems of the plants. And in the male habitat, they got a lot of vertical lines. So they had a high index of verticality. And where they found females, they found low index of verticality, lots of diagonal branches. And then he raised hooded warblers from eggs in the laboratory. They never saw a single plant in their life. And he put them in cages and gave them food. And on one side of the perch, he put a piece of paper with vertical lines. On the other side of the perch, he put a piece of paper with lots of diagonal lines. And the females huddled towards the diagonal lines, and the males huddled towards the vertical lines to feel safe.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it might be just something as simple as verticality.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's going to differ from species to species, but it's just interesting to think about the perceptual abilities of these birds and what it is they're cueing in on. Yeah, cool. We had one other question, and this person wanted to know, could you talk a little bit about birds as plant pollinators? And I know this is kind of off the cuff, but
there's a lot that has not been studied. This is just brand new, actually. And I've talked to a student at Oregon State University just this winter at a bird symposium who's looking at orange crown warblers and Wilson's warblers in vine maple as primary pollinators, perhaps, of that species. So it's a wide open field.
Of course, the hummingbirds we know are.
Of course, hummingbirds, yes, yeah. And they're also, as Jillian pointed out, the carpenter bee as a nectar thief. There are hummingbirds that are also nectar thieves.
Great. Well, we're going to have to leave it at that for now, but thank you so much for this great talk. I'm sure that lots of people enjoyed seeing your slides, and it's great to have some recipes for how we might do better at making habitats attractive to birds as well. So thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.